the security and compliance status for your business associates and subcontractors. Today's presenter is Anupam Sahai, co-founder and president of eGestalt. Anupam is an accomplished management, marketing, and technology leader with 21 plus years of experience directing teams to develop and launch globally renowned products generating up to $350 million annually. Prior to eGestalt, Anupam was Vice President Marketing for Ixia Inc. He is a recognized expert in the areas of healthcare IT, cloud computing, security and compliance, networking, and is a featured speaker at several industry conferences worldwide. During this webinar, we're going to launch, well actually at the beginning of this webinar, we're going to launch 3 poll questions. We wanted to be able to tailor this webinar on the fly, and also for our future webinars get an idea of who's attending these webinars so that we can make them as helpful as possible. So our first question that we're going to launch is, what is your current status? And the options are covered entity, business associate, service provider, and other. Go ahead and vote in the, what is this, the GoToWebinar panel area, admin area? I guess panel area. Go ahead and vote there and select one of those 4 options. And I will close the voting in 5 seconds. Great. Thank you all for voting. And the responses we got were 57% covered entities to the question, what is your current status? 57% covered entity, followed by 29% service provider. Our second poll question is, what is your position or role at the company? Your options are executive, compliance related, risk privacy related, IT related, or other. Please vote in the GoToWebinar area, and we will close the poll in 5 seconds. Okay, and the answers to the question, what is your position? Number 1 was risk privacy related. Number 2, compliance related. And the third question, very simple question, have you undergone a security risk analysis? Either yes or no. Okay, I'll close the poll in 5 seconds. So it's pretty close, Anupam. It's 55%, oh, it's 57% have undergone a security risk analysis. Okay, great. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them at any time via the question function in GoToWebinar, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. If you'd like a copy of the presentation, please send an email directly to Anupam. His contact information is there on the screen, and we'll give it to you at the end of the webinar as well. Additionally, we've recorded the webinar, or we're recording the webinar, so it'll be up on eGestalt's website within a couple of days. So I'll remind everybody where they can find the recording at the end of the webinar as well. Okay, thank you, Anupam, for presenting, and I'll turn the webinar over to you now.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are located. The topics that I will cover today include, I'll talk about some of the background requirements coming from HIPAA HITECH and Omnibus, and then dive into the requirements specifically coming and required for medical providers to manage their business associates and subcontractors. And then I'll talk about 7 steps or 7 questions that covered entities need to ask business associates and their subcontractors and vendors. And this will basically serve as a prelude to a full-fledged vendor management program. This is certainly a part of it. And then I'll talk about AG5 Secure GRC, which is an automated tool to manage end-to-end security and compliance issues, including for a covered entity. This includes the capability to automate managing of VAs and subcontractors that covered entities might have. And then I'll conclude the webinar with some Q&A. Before I start, some standard disclaimers and legalese that HIPAA HITECH continues to evolve and it's pretty much changing by the day. And there are multiple subjective interpretations of the law. What we present here today is a potential interpretation, and clearly we are not attorneys. Please consult your legal counsel, auditors, or advisors for definitive information based on that current day. Okay, so let me start off by talking about some background terms and acronyms so that we can use the same vocabulary as we go through the presentation. So HHS stands for Health and Human Services. This is the primary agency responsible for implementing HIPAA HITECH, and OCR is the Office of Civil Rights, which is the enforcement agency. And something that you'll hear me talk about and refer to quite a lot is PHI or EPHI, which stands for Protected Health Information, and it could be in physical form or in electronic form. And finally, covered entity stands for CE, BA stands for Business Associate. And I'll define these terms as we go along. So a covered entity is either a healthcare provider, a health plan, or a healthcare clearinghouse. And the provider could be a doctor, clinic, a psychologist, dentist, anybody basically that does any electronic transaction with HHS to either get paid or to do some verification is in that category. A health plan provider, such as an HMO or a health insurance company, or a healthcare exchange or healthcare clearinghouse, is within the purview of a definition of a covered entity. The definition of business associate is very broad, and essentially anybody who works in the healthcare community that deals with PHI, protected health information, either they access it, they transmit it, or they store it, or they use it, is defined to be a business associate. And I'll dive into a little bit more detail around what constitutes a PHI in the next few slides so that you'll understand the scope of it. But anybody who accesses and uses PHI is part of a definition of a BA. And so what that implies is that the kinds of entities that are construed to be BAs could be any of the following. It could be a IT service provider, it could be a hosting provider, attorney, accountant, garbage collector, etc., etc. MSP, if you're an MSP that is responsible for managing IT infrastructure of customers who are covered entities, then you are, by definition, a business associate. So, and there are about 2 million plus business associates right here in the US, just so that you know, in terms of sheer numbers. So having defined the CE and the business associate, let me jump right into what we see as game changers that have come about by the introduction of the HITECH Act, which was enacted in 2009. So 1996 was when HIPAA was enacted. The HITECH Act came about in 2009 as part of the American Recovery Act, and the HIPAA Omnibus was defined and formulated in early 2013, and that's going to be enforced starting September of this year. And there's some game changers that we need to be aware of. Certainly, the ability for the government agencies to do periodic audits of covered entities, business associates, and subcontractors included, and which means that all of these entities need to be HIPAA HITECH compliant, and there are penalties, there are criminal prosecution capabilities that are built into the system. The fines per incident category can be up to $1.5 million, and HIPAA Omnibus clarified this, that there's no upper ceiling for fines, and it can be $1.5 million per incident category. So if there are multiple counts or multiple incidents of violations, the fines can go up dramatically. And some of the other changes that took place are pertaining to the whistleblower clause, and the enforcement agencies can partake the proceeds which are a result of the enforcement. So if somebody gets fined, if entities are fined, both the whistleblower and the enforcement agencies get to fund their enforcement efforts or fund the agency efforts through to the fines that are recovered. So there's an incentive built into the system to ensure that enforcement happens in full swing. And state auditor generals can also act on behalf of the government, federal government, to ensure enforcement of HIPAA HITECH. But the two biggest changes that that we see is, one is the liability chain and the expanded definition of BA. So HITECH brought this about, and HIPAA Omnibus reinforces this, is that not only covered entities but business associates and subcontractors who are working with the covered entities to deal with PHI are required by law to implement HIPAA HITECH, and they pay the same set of fines, liabilities as a covered entity. And so there's a liability chain in place where a covered entity who's interacting with the patients shares the responsibility and liability with any downstream entities, whether it's a business associate or a vendor or a subcontractor, to protect and enforce privacy and security of PHI data. And finally, data breach notification requirements, which is essentially the case to deal with the scenario where patient information is breached, your organization is breached by some stranger breaking in and stealing PHI information. In that case, not only is a covered entity required to report to the government regarding any breach, but business associates and subcontractors who are in the liability chain have now requirements put in place to inform the entity upstream. So for example, BA will report it to covered entity if there's a breach that happens, and the covered entity would then go about reporting it to the government with the details of the breach. And HIPAA Omnibus has clarified that by default, the reporting structure, the breach notification reporting needs to take place unless there are some security risk analysis done by the covered entity to prove to the government that the breach did not happen, which is a pretty lengthy process. So by default, report it and then figure out whether you are safe by not having breached. So the fundamental changes that you see here, which essentially puts a lot of liability and puts fines and potential criminal prosecution in place for entities, whether it's covered entity, business associates, and subcontractors to implement HIPAA HITECH. Otherwise, they risk liabilities and criminal prosecution I talked about. They also risk fines. They also risk brand damage, which comes as a result of breaches that might happen, not to mention civil lawsuits that are brought about by patients whose information is lost as a result of negligence or what is called willful neglect. So it's a triple whammy for covered entities and business associates and vendors who are not following the law and cannot show that they made reasonable efforts to protect PHI information in case they get breached or audited. So it's a huge, there are a large number of entities that are responsible for implementing HIPAA HITECH. There's certainly the 700,000 odd covered entities, but there are millions of BAs that are required to be HIPAA HITECH compliant. And not to mention other kinds of regulations that businesses need to implement, such as PCI, which is required if you're implementing credit card transactions or doing credit card transactions. So this is part of the requirement, and the government has tried to sweeten the pot by providing stimulus money for implementing electronic medical records, which, by the way, is one of the ways to facilitate easier sharing of patient records. And the bigger objective there is to decrease the cost of healthcare administration and improve healthcare coordination, and thereby bring down the cost of healthcare administration, which is one of the objectives of HITECH and HIPAA. So every doctor can get up to $39K or $63K for implementing EMR. Larger hospitals can get a couple of $1 million depending on which stage of implementation they are. So the government has put together some incentives and stimulus money to help businesses implement electronic medical records. And in order to get the money, they need to show that they're compliant with HIPAA HITECH. The government maintains a website and a URL wherein all breaches that are reported to the government, HHS site, is posted up there. It's also called by many the HHS Wall of Shame. And essentially what it is a listing of which entities were breached, which reported, and these are breaches that affect 500 or more individuals. And if you go through the list, you'll find that all kinds of entities, whether it's a covered entity, a business associate, or a subcontractor, is part of this listing. And it's a pretty comprehensive list, and you'll see that the breaches are affecting businesses of any size. There's small businesses, large businesses of any type, covered entity, business associate, or a subcontractor. So it's a pretty prevalent, unfortunately quite prevalent in different types of business sizes. And as you can see here, based on the clippings that you might have come across, that the way it is that the cyber attackers are becoming very sophisticated. They're very organized. They have very sophisticated tools at their disposal, and they're going after businesses who have either electronic medical records, small or big, doesn't matter. And so the result is that breaches are pretty pervasive. Here are some examples of some notable breaches that took place. Stanford Hospital, TRICARE, and the big lawsuit amounts that you see here are basically coming from patient lawsuits asking for compensation for the privacy breach that took place. So not only the HHS comes after you if you're breached, but as I said earlier, patients can sue you for libel damage and privacy of violation of the records. And statistics tells us that even state level agencies are getting breached. Alaska, Utah are some examples. And as of March 2013, there have been 21.7 million records that have been breached as a result of about 550 breaches that took place in the last couple of years. And these are, mind you, 500 and above record-based breaches. For the breaches that affect less than 500 individuals, the numbers are comparable. So both small breaches and large breaches are pretty regular. And the HHS website here, excerpted from the HHS website, tells you the exact tally. They maintain a month-by-month tally on a per-month basis. So if you look at this column here, the rough number of breaches that are taking place on a monthly basis vary from 700 to about 990 breaches per month. And there are about 18,000 pending cases that are being investigated. And roughly about 25% of the breaches are actionable in terms of penalties and fines. So it's a burning problem. It's a very highly fast-moving issue that businesses need to address. It's not something that happens to somebody else, but it's affecting businesses of all size. And if you look at the business associate-related impact, roughly about 50% of the breaches happen as a result of business associates not taking care of the PHI information. So covered entities need to take proactive measures to ensure that PHI information that they're sharing with a BA or a subcontractor is protected very vigorously, and they cannot take a hands-off approach to deal with PHI information and how it's shared with the business associate. So, and I'll touch upon a little bit more detail as we go forward. So let me now kind of change gears and kind of dive into the details of what can covered entities do and what are the shared responsibilities that covered entities have with respect to PHI, and what can they do to work with business associates and vendors to protect the information. So let's define PHI first. PHI refers to health information and personal information. The personal information could be name, address, birth date, social security number. The health information could be past, present, or any future physical or mental health condition. So anything that can be traced back to an individual, whether it traces back to the personal information or to the health information, is construed to be PHI. And this PHI information could be in electronic form, or it could be in the form of a physical file that is typically seen in doctors' offices, because a number of them are transitioning from a physical file to electronic version, electronic medical record. And both of these need to be protected, in the physical version and the electronic version. So let's jump right into what are the responsibilities of a covered entity. So covered entity clearly has a shared responsibility along with the business associates to not only implement HIPAA HITECH internally to ensure PHI related sharing and privacy and security of PHI information within the organization is taken care of, but also the BAs that they work with are taking steps to ensure privacy and security of HIPAA HITECH privacy and security of PHI. So they have a shared responsibility and shared liability, if I can add that. And there are multiple things that they can do, but at the starting point, they need to have a good BA agreement to ensure safeguarding of PHI, to ensure that BA is bound and aware by the requirements from the HIPAA HITECH perspective. And they can, this also means that they need to ensure that not only internally that they have a breach notification plan, but BAs are also following through and implementing something like a breach notification plan. And all of this is required to get the federal grants that I talked about earlier, to get the Medicare and Medicaid payments for EMR implementation. They need to demonstrate what is called meaningful use, which requires interns to do a security risk analysis, which is part of HIPAA HITECH. So they need to implement HIPAA HITECH to ensure that they're taking care of their part of the responsibility, but they need to work proactively with the business associates to implement this. And I'll talk about 7 things that they can do proactively to ensure that they are proactively working to deal with the requirements coming from HIPAA HITECH and PHI safeguarding. If you're a BA, you have a shared responsibility to work with your covered entity. So if you're a BA or a subcontractor, either way, you need to work with the covered entity to protect and implement HIPAA HITECH to protect and safeguard PHI, and which means also to implement HIPAA HITECH privacy and security rules. And if you work with vendors as a BA, you need to instead also protect yourself to ensure the liability chain that I talked about with any downstream vendors are that agreements are in place so that they are following the law and ensuring protection and privacy of and security of PHI data. And the BA needs to report to the covered entity if there are any breaches that might happen. So all of this is required to implement HIPAA HITECH. They need to put together these best practices in place to ensure that they're protecting the data. And again, compliance is really a set of best practices that make businesses secure. And implementing HIPAA HITECH essentially allows you to put together a set of best practices in security to protect PHI information. And it makes you secure, it makes you compliant, and it's the right thing to do from the law implementation perspective as well. So that was a high-level overview. Now let me kind of dive into the next level of detail. So if I'm a covered entity, what can I do? What are the questions or what are the things that I can do to make sure that the business associates and vendors that I work with are doing the right thing? And the question that we often get asked is, how proactive and how probing should I be as a covered entity to ensure that the PHI information is protected? And you'll see the answer is that more responsibility that you can take in as a covered entity, the better it will be. So the first thing a covered entity needs to do is to ensure that the business associate has done a self-assessment to ensure and to understand where do they stand today vis-a-vis the HIPAA HITECH requirements. And this is a first important step for any business associate or a vendor to do, so that they understand what the gaps are, what the risk exposure is, and potential liability is with respect to protection and privacy of and security of PHI data. And if the gaps found, what is the remediation status? Have the gaps been plugged? Have the holes been plugged? And whether they're using third parties to do this, or is it being done internally? So those are all the right questions that a covered entity can ask and should ask their business associates and subcontractor. The second question is, BAs and vendors, have you done a risk assessment? And can I take a look at the copy of the results? And specifically, if there are remote accesses taking place of the PHI data, if the mobile access is taking place of the data, risk assessment becomes important to understand what's the risk exposure with these remote sharing of PHI information. If you look at some of the media latest breaches that have happened, it's happened because somebody in the business associate organization inadvertently shared and published the PHI information either on the web or on a social media network or using a mobile phone. And that's an important determination to make, which can be found out through a risk assessment process. Now, this might look like interfering, but this is an important question. When employees are hired, is there some risk mitigation taking place with respect to what kind of employees come in? Are they being trained properly? And this goes back to how employees understand the severity and the importance of protecting PHI. And so doing a background check is an important step in that direction. And then asking questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions about how is the PHI data going to be stored, accessed, shared, or transmitted. Because you as a covered entity want to make sure that privacy and security of PHI information is very critical. That should not be compromised. So if the data is sitting on a server in a business associate, and that server is accessible to any employee who walks in through the door, bad thing. That's a problem. Is it encrypted? Although encryption is not a mandatory requirement from HIPAA HITECH, it's definitely a prescribed or a recommendation. Similarly, if the data is being transmitted over the web, is it secured and transmitted over the web? So there are lots of things around storage, access, sharing, and transmission of PHI information that needs to be clarified. And training of the employees, I mentioned this earlier. Do employees know who has access to what data? And is there a secure card entry based access so that only the right employees who need to know or need to access information have access to the information? So there's a comprehensive training program, education program, along with the background check of the employee so that there's no misuse or potential either by mistake or inadvertent misuse of PHI information. And some of the covered entities who have a lot of leverage with the business associates, such as large hospitals, they sometimes demand that they want to do an on-site review, bring in their own internal auditors or external auditors, and require to get a first-hand glimpse of what are the practices that are being followed by business associates and subcontractors. So as you can see, there are different degrees of influence that a covered entity can have. And at one end, you can have a BA agreement with some soft commitments from a business associates. But if you have leverage, a lot of covered entities can go to the other end where they say, I want to come in and review and audit your infrastructure. And while asking for a self-assessment report and a risk report, they can go to this extent as well. And finally, ensuring that any business associate that works with subcontractors down the chain is also taking steps to ensure that they have an agreement in place with the subcontractors. And all of this, depending on the leverage that a covered entity has, all these 7 steps could be put into a business associate agreement that a covered entity can put together to ensure, again, implementation and safeguarding and enforcement of HIPAA HITECH rules, so that they are very, very sure about the steps that are being taken by BAs and subcontractors to ensure privacy and security of PHI data. So those are the things that are kind of the bottom line requirements, short of in making sure that every BA is compliant with HIPAA HITECH. Now I'll talk about AG5 Secure GRC, which is a cloud-based subscription tool which allows you to completely automate your end-to-end compliance management and security monitoring. And this includes, if you're a covered entity, you can use the tool to become HIPAA HITECH compliant, or if you want to manage your BA's compliance, HIPAA HITECH compliance issues, it will do it for you, completely automated, and manage your vendors in a completely transparent fashion. The tool comes built in with best practices, policy, and procedure templates so that you don't have to buy additional stuff. Everything is built into the tool. It comes with all of that you can customize so that you can put together a BA agreement with your subcontractors and business associates. Or if you are a business associate, you can use the tool to become HIPAA HITECH compliant. So it supports all of those models. And it's designed to be affordable by even small businesses, starting from small doctor's offices all the way to large hospitals. And it's designed, because it's cloud-based, doesn't have any hardware, it's much more cost-effective. I won't go into this workflow, but suffice it to say that the tool provides complete automation and visibility into the whole security and compliance process. I talked about being able to do a gap analysis. The tool will do that, help you do that. It'll do a risk analysis. It'll do a scan and discovery of all the assets and tell you all the vulnerabilities, and then help you put together a remediation plan with policies and procedures in place so that you can plug the gaps and then get a real-time status on your security and compliance status. Not only that, you can also have a complete view of any business associates and vendors that you work with to understand their security and compliance status as well. The tool comes in multiple editions. The standard edition is the entry-level pricing edition for small doctor's offices. Professional Ultimate is for medium to large businesses. So depending on your size of the business, you will choose one version or the other. The vulnerability management piece is an addition that you can add on if you want to discover assets automatically and map that to your compliance related results. And as I mentioned earlier, it scales up seamlessly from single doctor offices all the way to large hospitals, and depending on the size, the particular edition would be chosen based on the scope of assessment that's needed. I want to give you a quick glimpse of the tool so that you understand what is being automated, what's being shown. So this is what the end user dashboard would look like. Once the scanning has been done, once the compliance assessment has been done, it'll provide you with a real-time status of your security risk and the compliance risk. If the assessment's being pending, then you will get a complete visibility. And we sell through the channel. We have channel partners who are offering this as a managed service. So as a channel partner, they would have complete visibility into what the end customer is doing. And by the way, you can download a community version of the software from egistral.com. I encourage you to do that if you're interested in playing with the tool a bit further and understanding its capabilities. So how does the tool help you with the BA and vendor management process? So the first step is to define who are your BAs and external vendors that you want to understand and get them towards HIPAA HITECH compliance. So the tool needs essentially their email addresses and contact information that you can add, and each of the business associates will be sent a list of 20 questions. So the 7 steps that I talked about translates into 20 questions that are then sent via email to these BAs. And typically a covered entity might have anywhere between 5 to hundreds of BAs depending on the size of the entity. So by sending out these sample 20 questions, the BAs can then answer these questions, and the covered entity would get a high-level view of which BAs are high risk, which are medium risk, and which are low risk. And based on that determination, the covered entities can then pursue the high-risk BAs first by moving them towards compliance, followed by medium level and the low-risk BAs. So the intention is for you to get a probe of your BA status. Where do they stand with respect to their HIPAA HITECH compliance? What's the risk exposure? The 20 questions gets you in that direction first. Once you understand the risk exposure, then you can work with them to get them to implement HIPAA HITECH compliance by focusing on the high priority ones. And so it allows you to divide and conquer the whole process rather than talking to hundreds of BAs through a manual process and spending a lot of time and resources right up front. It allows you to divide and conquer and manage the whole BA management and vendor management process in a very systematic fashion. This is how the tool would do. You basically create external BAs, you add the email address, first name, last name, then you create these entries, select the BAs that you want to send this out to, and that's it. The BAs will get the questionnaire, which is a 20-question questionnaire that I talked about. These are all yes and no questions that they need to answer to questions to, and they will have lots of help in the tool that I'll show you to navigate the questions and answer yes and no questions. And as a covered entity, you will have complete visibility in terms of where do the BAs stand with respect to answering the questions. How many questions have been answered? Have they completed answering all the questions? All of that information is available to you, the covered entity, and the channel partner, so that you're completely aware of the progress or lack thereof. And as I said earlier, all the questions that are sent out are yes and no questions. We've translated all the HIPAA HITECH requirements into very simple yes and no questions and provided a lot of information that's built into the tool, such as policy documents that helps you customize the templates and upload it as evidence if you require it so. If you have your own policy documents, then you can use that in the tool as evidence. So this is an example of a breach notification policy that's available with a single click of the button, and you can adapt it to your organizational needs or use it as it is. It comes built in with BA agreement, which deals with all the aspects that a covered entity needs to manage to ensure that any business associate or vendors that they're working with are complying with the law. So it'll guide you through that, and again, you can customize this, add or edit it as required, and upload it and use it. The tool provides built-in research in the form of citation guidance, which helps you understand what the requirement is. It has implementation of best practices and implementation brief, which tells you, the end user, whether you're a covered entity or a business associate, it tells you how to go about implementing the requirement that's coming from HIPAA HITECH. So best practices tell you what typically is done. Implementation would tell you the few steps that you need to take to implement it. So the objective here is to provide you with ample guidance, which is available to you in the tool, right there in the tool, so that you're able to understand what's required from the HIPAA HITECH perspective and then take steps to go about implementing it while complying with the law. And the risk parameters built into the tool so that you know what's the risk exposure. The security posture management module will basically is implemented through a scanning agent that's required one per location. The scanning agent will scan your infrastructure, discover all the IT assets, and will kind of list down the top 10 vulnerabilities that exist. It'll tell you all the things that you can do to plug the gaps, plug the vulnerabilities that exist. There could be configuration problem, there could be a default password issue, or maybe it's just a software update issue. So it will guide you through all the steps that are required to plug the vulnerabilities that are found in the IT infrastructure. So again, the tool's intention is to automate everything, minimize manual work, provide you with every information that you need as a ready reckoner so that you're able to focus on doing the most important things rather than spending time on collecting information and trying to figure out what to do. It tells you how to do it, and that's part of the automation that the tool provides. And at the end of it all, you can generate what is called a report on compliance, which is really a documentation of all the effort that you've put in, all the steps that you've taken to ensure security and compliance procedures are being followed. And this is a documentation or a proof of HIPAA HITECH compliance that you have taken as an organization. And if you implemented the BA management module or the vendor management module, the report will also show you all the vendors or the business associates that you work with and the risk level exposure that these BAs bring about as a result of either complying with the law or partially complying with the law. So it'll tell you which BAs are exposed, what's your risk exposure, and thereby will tell you and guide you which ones to go after and work with to move them towards HIPAA HITECH compliance. So it's again completely soup to nuts solution that allows you to manage not only your internal HIPAA HITECH compliance but also external BA and vendor management programs to be put in place. Excuse me. And if certain BAs are found to be non-compliant, then you can pursue those business associates, use the leverage that you have to ensure that they are following the law and are moving towards compliance. Again, they can use the tool to become compliant and manage the whole process. So I know I covered a lot of information, but let me just summarize before we open it up for Q&A. So the covered entity clearly needs to follow the law, needs to be HIPAA HITECH compliant, but it also needs to ensure that any business associate or vendors that they work with, subcontractors or vendors that they work with, have a shared responsibility to implement HIPAA HITECH, to implement protection, privacy, and security of PHI information. And this is required by law. This is also required to get the federal stimulus money, and so there's incentive to do that as well. And you can implement and automate a vendor management program using Secure GRC. And one thing that I always say is that security and compliance is a journey. It's not a point in time, and it's an ongoing activity and effort that needs to be pursued. So it requires organizational commitment, it needs resources, owners, and certainly automation to help ease the process and make the journey much more smoother and enjoyable one. With that, let me open it up for Q&A. Mike?
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Anupam, for presenting. We'll open it up for questions right now. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the questions area of GoToWebinar. Anupam, here's our first question. Does HHS or OCR offer a draft BA agreement for covered entities to use as a baseline example?
Yes, they do. But last when I checked, it was pretty dated. So what we have done is we've looked at the BA agreement that's on the HHS website and updated it to include some of the high-tech and omnibus requirements. So yes, there is an HHS document, and I believe there is a paid version that you can get from another state medical agency. I forget the name. But again, they need some work and updating, I believe.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anupam. What are the shared risks associated with vendor management, and what if they are not doing it?
So if they are not doing it, and if a business associate or a vendor gets breached, then the covered entity will be having a shared liability. So which means that if PHI gets breached, the patients or the government can go after the covered entity and enforce the penalties, the fines, the criminal prosecution as a result of that. So it's important that covered entities take proactive steps that I mentioned in my presentation earlier to ensure that all the vendors are following the law and are HIPAA HITECH compliant.
Okay, thank you. How is secure GRC priced?
So secure GRC pricing is depending on the edition. At the entry level, for smaller businesses, roughly you're talking about $1,000 per year kind of a pricing. As you move up, if you're a medium level organization, you might pay up to starting at about $2,500 a year. The enterprise edition starts at $7,500 a year. And again, depending on the modules and control kits that you want to buy, the pricing can go up from there. But that's roughly the baseline pricing. And we can talk more if you're interested on the specifics.
And this is kind of a related question. How does secure GRC compare with other tools in the market?
Yeah, so that's a loaded question, but let me just simply say that in terms, we designed the AG5 Secure GRC to be delivered through channel partners, so it's designed to be channel friendly. We designed it to be a cloud-based delivery model so that the cost of ownership is very, very cheap, cost effective compared to anything that's out there. We are about 1/10 to 1/20th of any other comparable tool. And it's a complete soup to nuts solution, which is pretty much unique in the industry, where you'll find people selling policy documents for a price, some hardware-based vendors. So it's a complete soup to nuts solution delivered to the cloud, and it's very uniquely positioned and cost-effective to make it affordable.
Great, thank you, Anupam. Looks like we have no more questions. If you have any questions after the webinar, feel free to email or call Anupam at the contact information on the screen there. We've recorded this webinar as well, and we'll have it up on eGesalt's website within the next couple of days. Please check the website often. We have webinars on this topic and new topics related to this, updates and things like that. Routinely, probably around one a month or so. So please check the website for any information around future webinars. Thank you to the attendees for attending, and thank you, Anupam, for presenting. I'll leave the last word with you, Anupam.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for coming. Appreciate your audience, and please provide us feedback with respect to any topics that you would like to cover in the future webinars. Again, good morning and good afternoon to you, and thank you for coming.